I like starting by owning our own background. So I'm coming from the European Union. I was 35 years a policymaker in Brussels. And that's why my talk on the primacy of democracy and the rule of law over technology and the need to maintain it starts with our value basis. I want to say I'm not a Catholic. I have a complicated religious family history, but I'm very thankful to be allowed to speak here. And I think the Catholic Church has an enormous convening power and is an enormously important player also in politics. And I'm confident that the Church will continue to find allies in its ambition. And also if there is an encyclica on new technologies, on AI, I think it will be read by many beyond the Church. And I think it will be very important that it is a document which allows to connect many with all the different ideas and instruments for good. And we have heard a lot here, and I'm talking about the law, about international law and domestic law, but I would like to recognize from the outset that many of the approaches here we have heard in the room, the technological approach, the approach more based on rules for individual life, like Sarah Spiekermann has presented them. I've participated in her group, but also the red lines. I've participated also in the early launch as one of the people who supported this. All of this is necessary in parallel. There's nothing better or not better. We need all of this together. And I start with my value background, which is not so much the Bible. It is simply a European constitutional law, namely that our union is founded on the respect of human dignity, freedom, democracy as a value, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights. And this is what we want to maintain also in the future and also in the international relations. I just want to show you that we are completely used in the European Union to have a good dialogue with churches as partners in policymaking. And I can assure you, I have been myself the director for fundamental rights and also responsible for Article 17 implementation. It's a very good and lively dialogue and very fruitful. And I would say here in Rome, of course, it's much more intense, much more interesting, much more deep, the preparation. In Brussels, it gets a little bit diluted, but it's an important thing, I think, to realize that the Church is also a political player and influences politics through what the Pope says and other documents the Church produces. Now, the history of international lawmaking is that it has become increasingly difficult. AI is often compared to atomic energy. And in relation to atomic energy, it just took nearly just 4 years after the idea was born that we could use atomic energy for civilian purposes until a very strong agency was created in international law, which has inspection powers, even surprise inspection powers in atomic energy installations. That was in the 1950s. Then the law of the sea. I come from Hamburg. I've been myself a teaching assistant on the law of the sea. It took 15 years between the initial speech in the United Nations General Assembly and the biggest convention we have in the world, namely the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, again with a body of enforcement, a court, and also enforcement instruments. And then the panel, just to give you an idea, the panel of climate change until the Paris Agreement was created 27 years. So when we start with a panel in a policy area like we now do in AI, and I commend the outcome of the high-level group, which Carme has presented, that's a classic approach, but it's never the end. It is the beginning of a process, and the last time we did it on climate change took 27 years until we got to a multilateral agreement. And as we know, President Trump already second time now has left this agreement again, but it doesn't mean that it's not important. And we have moments of acceleration, by the way, also in the United States, when there's a catastrophic accident, Exxon Valdez, the ship which lost the oil on the coast and everybody could see it, Fukushima, 9/11 was an enormous accelerator of legislation in the United States and also in Europe. It took us at the time 9 months to adopt legislation of total surveillance of people in Europe, which later was annulled by the European Court of Justice. Of course, the Snowden revelations were an accelerator. I was myself the chief investigator for the European Union and spent a lot of time in Washington with the head of national intelligence in the White House to create a consensual report of what actually had happened here. COVID was an accelerator. So I would hope that we don't need such catastrophic accelerators to be convinced that we need binding rules on AI. We cannot wait simply because it's probably true what Bill Gates says and Elon Musk and others, that this technology is like atomic power. Great promise, but also great danger. And we have another issue here, which is classic in politics, namely the invisible risk and the inability of humans to see themselves as victims. And it's the great scholar Calabresi from Yale Law School who wrote the famous book on the cost of accidents, which led to the introduction of obligatory liability insurance for car accidents in the United States. A legislation which wasn't liked by the car industry, which is very strong in the United States, but he was able to show that economically it is beneficial to have this legislation because it better distributes the costs of accidents in society, namely towards those who carry the costs, and that it is not the optimal solution to leave management with the costs of the technology to the individual. So the argument that legislation is just a cost and an inhibitor of innovation is often wrong. And I would say in relation to the European Union, the professor of Columbia Law School, Anu Bradford, has quite recently published a good paper called The False Alternative Between Regulation and Innovation, in which he demonstrates in detail this whole discourse that innovation is hampered by legislation in Europe is wrong. So I refer to that paper if you're interested in this issue. I have here a few examples of which you all know, where the invisible risk led to a deadly delay of regulation. For example, to get a seatbelt installed in the cars by obligatory legislation, it took 10 years and it cost a few million lives worldwide. We knew that seatbelts will drive down the death on the street by 90%, but because of industry resistance, 10 years were lost. The same is true for smoking and cancer. The same is true for atomic energy. Maritime accidents on the high seas, we know they have enormous impacts on the environment, terrible impacts, but we only regulated shipping security rigorously when the oil came to the American coast and the American people were able to see it. Before, when the high seas, you don't see what's happening on the high seas. There was no regulation. Maritime industry has been the most under-regulated business for decades. And of course, personal data collection, same problem. And now AI, all these intransparencies that people don't know what's happening to them, what's happening to their data, all these are classic phenomenon which slow down regulation, but it doesn't mean that we don't need regulation. So where's the blockage coming from? Also in the AI high-level group in the United Nations? Well, the companies have overtaken the states in terms of economic power. Here you see the numbers. In 1990, the cumulated capitalization of the big American companies were 500 billion. The 7 big OECD states, 1.8 thousand billion. That was still the states dominant. When we look today at 2020, we have 9.5 trillion on the sides of the company and 4.8 trillion on the sides of the state. And the bigger the corporations relative to the states, the bigger their power is to stall progress of treaty making and lawmaking. So this is the question we stand before at this age of AI. Do we want a rule of financial AI and weapon power, a world dominated by power rather than under the rule of law? And we have the alternatives before us because we have policymakers out there who only build on power. They are not constrained by law anymore. Or do we follow the model that we continue to do what was good American tradition and is still European tradition, namely that we live under a rule of law in which we agree together, domestically in democracy and internationally by international law, the rules according to which we live. A foundation of our way of life is our national respect for law. What do you think is between the three points in the paragraph? Well, that's the American way of life. That's Eisenhower. Freedom under law is like the air we breathe. President Eisenhower again. So I think we need to come back to this good view of the law, the international law. And I think if we build a Big Tent, and the church can play an important role in this, together with the call for red lines, together with the many initiatives we have seen here in this room, the Big Tent will make it possible, even if the big corporations of this world may not like it. Thank you very much.